Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Top 5 series for Ryerson's alumni and friends. My name is Christian Mehta, and I am the AVP of Engagement at the university. Before we begin, I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the nature and people who lived on the land where Ryerson is located today. At the university, we have made a deep and long-lasting commitment to truth, reconciliation, and decolonization. And I invite you to learn more about this work online and in person next time we can get together on campus. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous pain and horror that we have witnessed over the last few weeks in the wake of anti-Black racism. We have organized a webinar on this very important topic for later this week, so I hope that you'll check your inbox and register for it as well. We know you've got a lot on the go, so this is a 30-minute webinar. We'll dive in quickly, but before I introduce Anna Triandafyllidou, I have just a few housekeeping tips to share. In about 20 minutes, Anna will be taking your questions. So if you want to ask something, please add your question to Zoom's Q&A area. Your cameras and mics are off, so I'll be selecting questions from that area. Second, if you're on social media, please use hashtag #RUTop5. And finally, we are recording this session, so if you want to rewatch it or share it with your networks, please look for a message from us in your inbox over the next day or two. Okay, so now on to our today's speaker. Anna Triandafyllidou holds the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Ryerson, where she leads an internationally recognized program to explore the contemporary challenges of migration and integration at the center of Canada's most diverse city. She is known globally for her expertise in the governance of migration and asylum, and in the management of cultural diversity, nationalism, and identity. Prior to her arrival in Toronto in 2019, Professor Triandafyllidou held a Robert Schuman Chair at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. She has lived and worked in Britain, Belgium, her native Greece, and the United States. Wow, Anna, thank you for joining us today. It's over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I'm delighted to be part of this webinars, and I'm delighted to meet digitally, I hope for next time in person, the alumni community of Ryerson. Indeed, I'm not an alumnus, but I have joined Ryerson recently in August 2019, and I'm a new immigrant to Canada. And I've been a migrant also in the past, mainly for work reasons. And I have started feeling a Torontonian, and indeed for all the reasons also that you mentioned, Christian, about not just the pandemic, but also the question of systemic racism and racial injustice, and both Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter. I think we live in turbulent, but also very, very interesting times. And I also want to say that I have found Ryerson particularly collegial, particularly welcoming, a very exciting, very innovative place. I think the students of Ryerson, all what you have been, the alumni, are a source of inspiration and a source of learning for me. And it is interesting that although formally we have a relatively low number of international students, as formally speaking, we are indeed the world in one place. And this for somebody who studies migration and the many migration experiences that our students and our faculty and our alumni have is just a wonderful source of richness. Having said this, let me just go through my 5 main takeaways of how the pandemic is reshaping migration and migration governance. And we all know that migration is a very important part of who Canadians are and what is the future of Canada. So it's both an area of policy, but if you want, also part of our value system and of our identity. And I allow myself to say are just as a new Canadian as part of this. So I think the pandemic, first of all, is a magnifying lens of things that existed before. It does not create new situations or new challenges, but rather it has magnified both in the negative, but sometimes also in the positive, as I will argue, things that pre-existed before. So first of all, essential workers. I think we are witnessing across the world, and in Canada in particular, a very interesting reflection about who among the migrant workers are essential. So for Canada and for many of the world's main destination countries for international migration, essential workers were thought to be the highly skilled migrants. So the IT engineers and the doctors and the managers. But we are now discovering that there are some people who are truly essential, and they're not necessarily among those professions. And these are farm workers for one, but also care workers of different kinds, people working in the food processing industry, all the frontline workers in different retail stores that have remained open throughout the pandemic. And I think this is really, well, first of all, it's given rise to some policy innovation with its gaps. We know just as of yesterday and today, there is now in the media, in the government, a consideration about the gaps in the protection in the farm workers, because basically the government regulated very well what happens during the quarantine, but then after the quarantine, the workers were left to their own devices, or rather to the devices of their employers, with unfortunately very tragic consequences sometimes. The other thing is, though, we have seen a small but still important Agrifood pilot, which was inaugurated. It was launched just on the 15th of May. And we do think, for instance, there could be some developments also in relation to asylum seekers that are frontline workers. You may have witnessed the debate that has been going on in Quebec, because some asylum seekers had been retrained and employed in senior care homes. And we all know how difficult it has been in senior care homes. It's not an easy decision, and I know the Quebec government is not very much in favor of regularizing or creating a preferential path for permanent residency for these people. There are considerations. So what if I am an asylum seeker and I was not a frontline worker, what then for me? But I think just the reflection is a very positive thing, and opens up I think some considerations that we need to make, as I said, about who is essential and who is more or less essential. That brings me sorry, to two further points that I want to make. One, I hear somebody say such an echo. I'll try to slow down, maybe it will be better. So I want to say something about the highly skilled workers, because these are still important for Canada and for many countries, and many of them are stuck in limbo. Stuck in limbo because they have been approved to come to Canada with a work permit or with a permanent residency approval, or who are stuck here because their permit is expiring. And of course, the IRCC has been quick in saying, okay, we renew work permits, we process the request for landing for people who are in Canada, but the pandemic is truly causing a lot of concern. In a short blog, in a short policy blog with a colleague, the blog is published in First Policy Response, an initiative of Ryerson. We have argued for something called temporary remote work permits. So suggesting that for those who have been approved or who are being processed, are approved and cannot yet come, and where the professions allow for people to work online, they could be given temporary SIN numbers and temporary work permits for, say, a period of 3 months until they can truly join us in Canada and continue working from here. So avoid something that could be considered, dumping, job dumping, just hiring somebody for, a cheaper salary somewhere else, like pay Canadian, what was agreed, but have the person start online, because we can imagine that some of these people had, sometimes sold their houses or stopped renting, quit jobs, and were ready to go. Or they had not applied for another job because they had an offer in Canada. And I think this is important, both by respect to the people, but also in terms of Canada's long-term commitment to immigration. my fourth point, does the pandemic raise any questions about what it means to belong? And I'll say something that refers to my own experience. I'm here, I'm not a permanent resident. I'm here for the time being with a work permit. And when Canada closed its borders, it so happened my spouse was abroad. So he had really to hurry to the airport, take the first flight back to Canada because the border, it was a Monday. The border was closing on Wednesday, and initially only citizens and PR could come back. I think I want to praise this. You might think I want to criticize, but the truth is I want to praise the Canadian government because very quickly, I think, civil society organizations pointed, and probably the IRCC themselves realized, there are a lot of people here who are not formally permanent residents, but who are in effect permanent residents or long-term residents. And that does not include somebody does not only include somebody like me, but also international students that may have been here for 5 years, 6 years, and are not yet PR, or also, people in the work permit category that have different types of temporary permits, but who effectively have their life here. And then what the government said, so as I said, it was a Monday, the border closed on Wednesday. On Friday, the government reconsidered their decision and said, no, the border is open, also for study and work permit holders, who, however, can effectively prove they do live in Canada. So they have some bill in their name, they rent, they live in the country. And that has prompted me to think, okay, what does it mean to be a member of the community? So clearly citizenship is the obvious answer. But also it prompted me to think, what are your responsibilities towards the community and what makes you a member of the community? And effective residence is a different marker than citizenship. And it has prompted me also to think about certain considerations that have been made about the fact that newcomers in Canada are on one hand more worried about the pandemic. But they seem to be more compliant with the recommendations of the government in terms of distancing, wearing a mask, following these routines that we all now know well. And it brought me also to think about some examples that we read in the media. I'll say one example from the country where I lived the previous 10 years, Italy, where when the pandemic really broke out that was in early March, in the north of the country, several students, the universities closed, and several students who were originally from the southern Italian regions, took the first train to the south, although the government was recommended that everybody should stay where they were, because precisely there was a community outbreak in Lombardy, and they shouldn't be carrying the virus across the country. Not only some of these young people not only went back to their parents' places, but they even went to visit their grandparents, whether in senior care homes or in their homes. And there have been, fortunately, some very limited, community cases, which then prompted one to ask, what does it mean to be a citizen? These young people were citizens. And of course, there was no, at the time, initially, there was no closure of the regional borders within the country. But I think being a citizen is also about being responsible and being respectful for your community and for something that is not your private good, but is a public good. And it's something that is beyond your control, because once you even without thinking, of course, it wasn't done on purpose, you spread the virus. Now we're all affected. We have responsibility towards one another. And that has been, I think, a reflection that the pandemic has prompted in many countries, as some governments even imposed regional closures. So, and we have it in Canada also among the provinces, but even for smaller, geographically much smaller countries where people could not move between regions or between cities. And I think that brings me to the last main point of my introduction, which is, again, trying to think more positively. What does the pandemic teaches us? And I think it teaches us a certain sense of humility, in the sense that the pandemic has shown that all of those of us who thought we had our lives sorted and under control discovered that we can be much more vulnerable than we thought. And that vulnerability is not a particular feature of asylum seekers or of precarious workers. It can touch also those of us with secure legal statuses, with well-organized lives, with secure jobs, for all the contracts, all the welfare payments, and everything. And I want to hope that this is inspiring a politics, I would say, of solidarity and a politics of empathy, rather than a politics of racism and xenophobia. We have seen, unfortunately, the pandemic, at least initially, fueling racism, both among members of our own communities, and I'm not just talking about Canada, but in many countries. For instance, racism against people who look Asian, but and we have seen also in some cases closures towards asylum seekers or migrants. It hasn't happened so much in Canada, but for instance, in my native Greece, asylum seekers who were in refugee camps were asked, and in a way were forced, to remain in the camps when there was an outbreak in the camp, not to go out in the urban area, or for those who were in islands, not to go out on the island. We have seen in Singapore dormitories, and in the Gulf states, in the dormitories of construction workers. In Singapore, it's mainly domestic workers. When there was a community outbreak, people being closed in those premises. So I want to hope that the pandemic will, however, give us all an opportunity to reflect on solidarity rather than exclusion. And I will finish by saying that maybe this now huge transnational mobilization against racism may have something to do with this kind of empathy and this kind of vulnerability that we all experienced under the pandemic, and the realization that we need to fight for a more just society. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Wow, Anna, thank you so much, and such important insights on the state of the union, so to speak, both domestically but also internationally. There are a few questions coming in from various places, so just bear with me. This first one is from someone with the name starting with A. Why do you think seasonal agricultural workers coming to Canada do not have a path for permanent residency, despite many of them coming here for up to 8 months each year for many, many years?
Well, you want my honest opinion. It's
do.
because Canada wants to be a knowledge-based economy, a knowledge-based society, and the farm workers do not fit this view. So exactly, until the pandemic, they were thought of being disposable. They should come, but then they should go. This is not part of those we want to attract. But I think we now realize that, as the person asking the question points out, these are people who are members of those communities where they live, and they're actually also important contributors to the local economies, the local societies, the local markets, not only through their work but also through their consumption, through their lives there. And yeah, I totally believe that the Agrifood pilot should be expanded significantly, because it is an innovation, but it is a tiny one. It's 2,750 people and their families between now and 2023. And we all know that Canada tends to accept about 60,000 farm workers every year in normal years.
Thank you. This question is from Aaron. Cases of COVID-19 amidst the migrant farm worker community has shone a light on a general lack of knowledge about Canada's food system, how our food is grown, where our food comes from, who is actually cultivating the crops and fields. What positive outcomes will the pandemic bring in terms of Canadians realizing how dependent we are on others? Big question.
That is also interesting, because I think the farm workers have been, like the caregivers, have been somehow under the spotlight precisely because they were temporary, and they had special, the caregivers, special requirements to get to a path towards citizenship. The farm workers, the near impossibility, complete impossibility to become permanent residents. But then for instance, the food processing industry was not under the radar. And this is an industry that in Canada and in many countries is actually, staffed by migrant workers, because it's a tough and not pleasant industry. And I think what is also interesting, like in Canada with meat, and in Britain, for instance, in the British Isles with fish, in Norway with fish, in Italy with prosciutto. These are some of the industries that are culturally very much valued as somehow the essence also partly of the national landscape and the national identity. And I think that leads us, I hope, to a reconsideration of who is an essential worker, and not just what is essential work, because I think the danger there is that we say, okay, this is important work, but the workers are not important. And I think in terms of policy, what we need is, for instance, agri-food policy to go hand in hand with migration policy. Because there, I also want to acknowledge that oftentimes, not so much in the food processing industry, but particularly in agriculture, the employers are very highly pressurized by the big retail chains, the supermarkets, who basically impose often situations of oligopoly, controlling the prices and really reducing profit. This is no excuse for exploiting workers, but I think the government needs to see the whole picture and act from different fronts on this.
Well, that actually leads into another really important question here about rebuilding the Canadian economy after the pandemic, and how migration policy needs to change to facilitate this. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I won't try to bluff you. I think it's too early for us to say something truly scientific, because we don't yet have data. We have some insights on what is happening. I think certainly one thing that has been understood is that it's not that we took a 3-month break or a 5-month break. We held our breath, closed our eyes, waited for it to pass, and we go back to where we were before. Fortunately or unfortunately, this is not going to be the case. So there will be reorganization in the labor market. So for instance, and for what concerns migration, we see that the medical and paramedical and related research professions will be very high in the recovery. And if you just think that the good scenario, we find a vaccine, they say maybe Oxford by October will have a vaccine that they will be able to distribute. We need millions of those. This is a huge task, but also huge business. So I think this is a sector that will boom much more than before. And also all the related sectors that relate to preparing for a possible next pandemic. Not necessarily, of course, I know many of us are worried about this one, doing a second or a third round, but even assume we have a vaccine, so a second or third round becomes unlikely. We could have another pandemic in 10 years. At least we should make treasure of this lesson that was really tough. Something else. Are we going to see changes because of how much we all, when we can, have used teleworking and online meetings?
Great question.
Will we see some lasting changes in the way we work? So will we see, okay, for instance, a reduction in travel, which has important positive environmental consequences, but also, for instance, think about multinationals and the kind of upper middle jobs. Whether multinationals would think, okay, I keep people in my seat and only send them for 2 weeks abroad, and for the rest they telework. So we had seen some of this happening through digital platforms and through also technologies like Zoom or Teams, etc. But will we see a huge increase on that? That is another issue. Third, I think something that Canada and many countries have been considering. Will we see that some countries will want to be relatively autonomous or self-sufficient in some sectors? And will this shape international trade differently? I think that is another question.
And the question also comes up around, as you talked about earlier, the kind of understanding the diversity within what we consider to be an essential worker, that these are also, in some instances, highly trained individuals coming here, or individuals who are supporting families or economic prosperity for the country. This question really talks about that expansion and kind of the salary disparity amongst professions like grocery store clerks, cashiers, bus drivers, and others. Many of these professions are paid at a minimum wage and obviously have long hours in the job. So they also don't necessarily come with a great amount of respect in our communities. What are your thoughts on this? How do we address salary disparity, and how does that relate to our understanding of migration?
I think this is also a very important point, because in many of the advanced economies, we notice also a fragmented labor market. And that was a discussion that happened in Canada at the end of March and early April, when it became clear that there would be a shortage on farm workers. And some people said, okay, Canadians should go take these jobs, and those who are left with unemployed. And some employers in the farm said, no, they're not good, they don't know the job. So I think that there are two things, two lessons to be learned. One is that indeed the farm worker is a skilled job. It's not as unskilled, or being in the food processing industry is a skilled job. It doesn't require a PhD, but it is not a job that any one of us can do without appropriate training. If you want to do it fast, efficiently, know the routines, every product is different. You have to follow some guidelines. So that is one lesson learned. The other thing is, truly, I think labor markets are fragmented, and what we see sometimes, local workers won't take a job even if they are unemployed, either because this is low prestige, low pay, or simply, we know from the literature, because this has been kind of labeled a migrant job, a newcomer job, a temporary migrant job. And we know from migration research that this is very difficult to fight. So I think there are two things to consider. So one is to improve conditions for those jobs, and to provide, for instance, for better monitoring mechanisms. What we have seen in farm work, unfortunately in Canada, is that normally workers are afforded all the protections, but oftentimes they don't have the necessary information about what are their rights and how they can access those rights. And particularly if things go sour with their employer, they don't always know who to turn to. They're not proficient often in English or French. And normally the system here is complaints triggered. So a worker has to complain for something to happen. But what we were, again, proposing with Lucia Nalbandian in the first policy response blog was that there should be frequent monitoring, and if you want, a frequent assessment of what are the conditions and whether the employers do fulfill the promised conditions, rather than expecting the migrant to and complain.
So, Anna, we have one more question for you. Hold on one second. This is about solidarity building. You started off your talk about solidarity. What is your perspective on how we can build solidarity in our communities?
Well, first of all, I think there is a lot of solidarity in Canada. So we should not, we should also think of all the good things that in the towns and in the cities of Canada we're doing. But I think what is needed mostly right now, and particularly in relation to anti-Black racism, is to try, and I say this in full cognizance that I'm a white person, so I'm not visible. I'm a newcomer, but I'm not a visible minority, and that makes your life easier. I do realize that, but that is the challenge. Put yourself in the other's shoes and try to think. You cannot really experience it, but try to think how the other person feels. And that's where I was saying, I think the vulnerability that we all experienced in the pandemic, or if you want, it's just not unemployment, it's mental health issues, family challenges, all this. Let this become a springboard for us to feel more solidarity about our fellow citizens and the challenges they face.
Well, listen, Anna, thank you so much for being here. We're unfortunately out of time, but for all of you participated and asked questions, thank you so much for taking the time. As I mentioned earlier, we are recording this session, so check your inbox for this recording, as well as some resources and links to the work Anna is pursuing these days. It's very important work, and Ryerson is so lucky to have you, Anna. It's amazing the scholarly work that you're presenting to all of us, as well as your reach into the community. We are so grateful and look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you all for being with us. And yeah, well, please do not hesitate to contact us if you're interested in any of the issues discussed today.
Wonderful. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you hopefully on the next webinar in a few days. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Anna.